Okay, so as I said, these are our EDI training sessions. Today we have Susanna, and I'll introduce her in a bit, but just some housekeeping rules. So the meeting will be recorded, the session will be recorded, but it will be used mostly for kind of our internal purposes. And we will abide by the Chatham House rule in this session. So participants are free to use the information they received, but neither the identity or the affiliation of the speakers or any other participant can be revealed. So just make sure when you leave this space, the information that you take is not kind of identifiable of others. And just some other general rules: be respectful, be kind in your communication. So if you don't agree with someone, rather than challenging the person, kind of challenge the idea. We're open for discussion, obviously. Just make sure to listen to the other person as well. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand or post the question in the chat, whatever feels better for you. Mute your microphone when you're not speaking. Turn your camera on when you are speaking. You can also have your camera on for the duration of the session. And there will be a feedback form that I'll post in the chat at the end, but also you will receive it by email to share some thoughts. So now that we got that out of the way, let me introduce Susanna. Susanna will talk today about her experience in patient and public institutional involvement in working on gender diversity as a woman with a trans history pre- and post-transition. Susanna has significant personal lived experience of patient and public institutional involvement. She's a lay examiner for both the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, Part 3 membership examination, and for the Royal College of Surgeons. She's also a member of the Royal College of Physicians Patient and Care Network and was a member of the Royal College of Physicians Working Group developing a training credential in gender identity medicine. And I know Susanna from my work on the Loaska study, where she was part of our expert advisory group. So I will now hand over to her.
Thanks, Dora. Can everybody hear me okay? Fine. That was a very, very comprehensive introduction, and I hope with my together with the note that I've circulated in advance, that it's given you quite a lot to, as they say, chew on, really. And it's important, I think, for you to take advantage of this to raise questions. There's nothing that you're going to ask me, I suspect, because there hasn't been so far in all the sessions like this I've done, where I'm unable to answer questions, or I don't want to answer questions because they're kind of personal or intrusive or whatever. The important thing is that you get the opportunity, take most advantage of the opportunity that this provides to ask me to ask questions and to explore issues which may be bothering you in this context, because we are talking about an issue which really is, I think, heated up, frankly, in the last few years. I mean, I got involved sort of at the sort of should we say, the advocacy end of things, about 6, 7, or 8 years ago, with joining NHS advisory groups, and I became a member of the Stonewall Trans Advisory Group, and so on and so forth. And it was a very different environment, really. We felt things were progressing, and then the context rather changed, and what we've had in the last, I'd say, last 2 or 3 years is the advent of a kind of pushback, if you like, in terms of the activism of, I suppose, what you'd call gender critical groups, who are driven by a particular perspective on women's issues, and there's a spectrum of that. Some of them would say, this is intrusive in terms of women's issues, we're not against trans people in general, because it generally tends to be focused on trans women. Trans men seem not to cause so much excitement to these groups, and it it causes it's generated a lot of sort of Sturm und Drang, I think, if you're familiar with that expression, where at one level it's just sort of protest, about men, so-called men using women's lavatories or whatever, or at the other end it's a little more severe than that, where the groups involved have organised, like Sex Matters and so on, who have become very active on the in the policy area, really, and lobbying government and generally sort of raising the issue. If you look very carefully at those issues, you will find that, what's the substance? It always tends to be at the level of generality, that somehow, quotes, men are invading women's spaces. At the other level of generality, it's about not only men invading women's spaces, but it's men who are a danger to women and girls in these spaces. And the focus is, curiously enough, is on lavatories and changing rooms. It's quite extraordinary, really, when you think of it. I find it rather puzzling, really, because I've been going into those spaces both before transition, fully transition, and post-transition, as a trans woman, and it was, quite frankly, quite safe, and I've never personally felt any kind of difficulty in doing that, or have had any reaction to it. But it's become much more critical of late, and it's driven by what I can only see as illogical sort of perspectives on the threat posed by, in this case, trans women, not trans men, and it's and I can't see it. So, because when I take I've got 3 granddaughters, young granddaughters, who are, the age of 8, 9, and we go into a women's changing room or a women's lavatory. I mean, what's going to happen? What are we talking about here? I mean, it's absurd, really. I mean, am I a threat to any other woman or young person, young girl in those situations? No. And I think if you look at the record, if anyone here can point to me a situation in which a trans woman in a woman's lavatory or whatever, or a changing room, has actually caused offence, insulted, assaulted a woman or girl, I would be very surprised to hear about it, because frankly, given the level of activism that gender critical people are talking about, we would have heard about it. My goodness, we would have heard about it. And it's extraordinary, really, I find, that the focus on this is on access to what are called women's spaces. Well, who else would want to go into a woman's lavatory apart from a woman, or or apart from a woman? So it is quite a surreal situation. As I said, it's developed really very much over the last 3 or 4 years. Before that, we didn't really have that kind of issue, but we do now, and it's been hyped up, and there's a kind of process going on that somehow that presents me and people like me as a threat. And I was looking at, for want of something better to do, I was looking up on the way in which people had reacted to me on the web, and some of the things that people say, I mean, are really quite extraordinary. That they're very offensive because they just talk about me as a man, and that's happened in a couple of occasions when I was in things that I was involved in, notably with the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, where I was on a women's advisory group, and one of quite an activist woman who shall be nameless sort of started complaining online, and presenting it in Mum's name and so on, that here I was, this man who was actually involved in women's health issues. Well, actually, given my biology and the biology of a large number of women, trans women, particularly if they've transitioned and had surgery and so on, their bodies are, kind of have are impacted in a way that many women, cisgender women's bodies are impacted. So the idea that I wouldn't have something to say about women's health issues in that context is, frankly, if you reflect on it, a bit bizarre. But I mean, don't confuse this with the facts. So that's some of the background personally about the curious environment we're working in at the moment. Now, the reactions to that are strange. I mean, when I was doing some work with Stonewall, I remember talking to Ruth, who was then the director, and we said, "My goodness me, it looks like we're having some success in breaking through on this," because Theresa May was very supportive, as the leader of as she was prime minister, wasn't she? Very supportive. Stonewall was doing some very, very good lobbying on trans issues, and it started sort of, we thought, we're making progress here, but then it kind of all seemed to come to us kind of skidding halt, and we've got the sort of, and you have a paradox really, because I've been in meetings with people like Tony Blair and so on, who was instrumental in his administration in advancing the support for trans people. So the Labour Party's got a very good reputation in this, but somehow it started to go mute, and having and the kind of, what shall I say, vacillation or dissembling that you've seen, with this nonsense where, Keir Starmer sort of can't say what a real woman is. I mean, it's very simple. There are briefings about what this is all about, but somehow it doesn't get through. And we're now in a position where the Equality and Human Rights Commission came out with, after a consultation, so-called, with some interim guidance, which frankly was a manifesto for trans exclusion from public spaces. I mean, I don't think you put it any stronger than that, any lesser than that, because that's what it is. Now, and that seemed to be, making a lot of ground, because it was in the context of the Supreme Court decision. Now, which was there's really serious issues about the interpretations in that decision. But the EHRC jumped in with this and came out with this interim guidance, which incidentally was now taken to court by the Good Law Project last week, and it has had quite a dusty response, frankly. Even the minister, who the Secretary of State, was moved to be quoted against in the context of the evidence that was given to the court, that this was there were problems with the approach, and we've now got to a position, I think, where there's a sort of stasis, where exactly the law is going, and in the current context, it's causing a huge amount of angst. But we have to remember that actually, in fact, and this is often, this truth is often obscured, is that the law has not changed. The Equality Act has not changed. There's been no further guidance, which is statutory guidance. So basically, what the circumstance, the framework in which I sort of transitioned in and have been working in ever since has not changed. So we're waiting on that. And I think what's happened now is that the government is marking time on that, has realized that, it's got enough on its place without actually getting involved in this thing, because it will actually eventually go if the law, if any sort of policy changes, if they're damaging to, if you like, to trans people, will actually go to the European Court of Human Rights, and it'll actually go through court again. It'll be back to the Supreme Court, and it will be an almighty nonsense, really. When in fact, everything was working quite well before this. The issues are about the delivery of care, and that's what we might want to talk about, because there are more and more people seeking care, either male to female transition or female to male transition. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of young people's transition, which is also a huge problem, frankly. So, we're in a very sort of complex and difficult situation, I would say, at the moment, where people are confused as to what's going on, and basically, it's causing a lot of problems and distress, and it's against a background of the problems of access to care, appropriate care. So those were a few introductory words. And I'm sorry if it sounds a bit sort of hectoring or hard line or whatever, but we are in a very, very, I think, quite a difficult position and a different place at the moment, and quite needlessly, I think. Okay.